He rewound the footage 3 times before his hands stopped shaking. On the screen, his mother, 81 years old, alone in the kitchen of the house he'd bought her, was on her knees, picking shattered glass off the floor with her bare fingers, blood already pooling at her fingertips, while 2 of his household staff stood in the doorway and laughed. He didn't understand what he was watching. He didn't understand why nobody moved to help her. He didn't understand how long this had been happening before tonight. Before he happened to open an app on his phone he hadn't touched in 8 months. But he was about to find out. And by morning, half the people in that house would no longer have jobs. Hello, friends. I always wonder how far these stories travel. Are you watching from the US, Canada, the Caribbean, South Africa, Kenya, or somewhere else? Stay with me for this one. It's a long story, and I promise it's worth every minute. To understand how far Marcus Webb had drifted from his own mother's life, you have to go back 3 weeks to an ordinary Tuesday that felt, at the time, like nothing at all. He was in a car between meetings when his mother called. He almost let it go to voicemail. He was reviewing a term sheet, his assistant reading numbers aloud in his other ear, but something made him pick up. Marcus. Her voice was warm, the way it always was, careful not to sound needy. I just wanted to hear your voice. Mom, I'm actually in the middle of something. Can I call you back tonight? Of course. Of course, go ahead. He didn't call her back that night. Or the next. When he finally did, for days later, she didn't mention it. And he didn't think to apologize, because in his mind nothing had actually gone wrong. Bills were paid. Staff were in place. The house ran itself. Or so he believed. He measured his responsibility to her in the size of the checks he signed and the quality of the house he'd bought. And by that measure, he told himself, he was doing more than most sons ever did. He didn't know, that Tuesday, that his mother had hung up the phone and sat alone at her kitchen table for a long time afterward, the way she'd been sitting alone at that table more often than he could have imagined. He didn't know that "I just wanted to hear your voice" was, more and more, the only kind of reaching out she allowed herself anymore. Because anything more direct, "I need you, I'm scared, please come," had started to feel, to her, like asking for something she wasn't sure she was still owed. He went back to his term sheet. The car kept moving. And 3 weeks later, a notification would arrive on his phone that would make every one of those small, ordinary refusals suddenly visible all at once, like a photograph developing in reverse. The picture that had been there the whole time, finally coming into focus. He would look back on that phone call more than any other moment, wishing he had simply told his assistant to wait 5 minutes, wishing 5 minutes had ever once, in his entire adult life, felt like enough to give her. It started with a notification. Marcus Webb almost didn't open it. He was in a boardroom on the 19th floor, half listening to a vice president walk through Q3 numbers, when his phone buzzed against the table. Security alert, motion detected, kitchen camera 2. He'd installed the cameras 2 years ago, after his mother's first fall, and then he'd done what busy men do with safety measures, trusted them and stopped looking at them. The app had sat unopened on his phone for 8 months. He almost swiped it away. Then something, he would never be able to explain what, made him tap it instead. The video was 11 seconds long. He watched it standing in the hallway outside the boardroom, his back against the wall, the meeting forgotten behind the closed door. His mother, Eleanor, in her housecoat, reaching for a glass on the top shelf because no one had moved it down for her like he'd asked, twice. The glass slipping. Eleanor going down with it, onto her knees, onto the broken glass, and not crying out. That was the part that broke him, because some part of her had already learned that crying out brought no one running. 2 staff members appeared in frame. Denise, the day housekeeper, a woman he'd hired himself for years ago on good references and a warm interview. Paul, who handled the grounds and odd jobs, a quiet man Marcus had barely exchanged 10 sentences with despite paying his salary every month for 3 years. They stood in the doorway. They did not move to her. Denise said something Marcus couldn't fully hear, low and dismissive, and Paul laughed. Actually laughed, while Eleanor kept picking up glass with her bleeding hands like a woman who had stopped expecting anyone to help her get up. Marcus stood in that hallway for a long time. Somewhere behind him, muffled through the door, he could hear the vice president still talking, still clicking through slides, entirely unaware that the most important meeting of Marcus's year was not happening in that room. He thought about the last 6 months. The calls he'd taken from his mother that lasted 90 seconds because he was walking into another meeting, phone wedged between his shoulder and his ear while he signed something with his free hand. The visits he'd promised, next weekend, Mom, I promise, and rescheduled, sometimes twice. The way she'd started saying, it's fine, don't worry about me, before he'd even finished asking how she was. He thought about how convenient it had been to believe the house ran itself. How he'd built an entire staffing structure specifically so he wouldn't have to think about any of this. The meals, the medications, the small daily indignities of getting older in a body that no longer cooperated the way it used to. How he had paid good money for peace of mind and had never once stopped to check whether the peace was real or just the appearance of it. He didn't go back into the boardroom. He walked straight to the elevator, and by the time the doors opened on the ground floor, he'd already called his assistant to cancel the rest of his day. The drive took 40 minutes. He used 18 of them to call his head of security, a man named Reyes who'd worked for Marcus for 9 years and had never once had to be told twice. I need the full archive, Marcus said. Every camera, every room. 6 months back. Anything specific I'm looking for, sir? No. Just get it ready. All of it. He used the rest of the drive to sit with a feeling he didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't quite rage. It was blue now, her hands wrapped in a dish towel going pink at the edges. Denise was nowhere in sight. The room had already been cleaned, the glass swept, the floor mopped, the counter wiped down, like nothing at all had happened, like the last hour had simply been erased. Mom. He crossed the room fast. He knelt in front of her chair and gently unwrapped the towel. The cuts weren't deep, but there were 6 of them, and none had been properly cleaned or dressed. Dried blood had already begun to crust at the edges. I'm fine, she said, the way she always said it now, automatically, like a reflex. It was clumsy of me. Who cleaned this up? She hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Denise. She was very quick about it. Did she help you up? Eleanor looked down at her hands. Paul did. Eventually. Eventually. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The words sat in the kitchen between them like something with weight. Get your coat, he said. I'm taking you to get these looked at properly. Marcus, it's really not, Mom. His voice cracked, just slightly, just enough that she looked up at him properly for the first time since he'd walked in. Please, let me take care of this. Just this once, let me. She nodded slowly, and something in her face softened in a way that told him she hadn't expected him to ask that way, like a request instead of a decision already made for her. He drove her to urgent care himself, sat in the waiting room while a nurse cleaned and dressed 6 cuts on his mother's hands, and didn't check his phone once, even as it buzzed steadily against his leg. He drove her home, settled her into bed, and sat with her until her breathing evened out into sleep, something he realized, watching her, he hadn't done since he was a child and she used to sit with him. Then he went down to his study. Reyes had left the archive loaded and ready. 14 cameras, 6 months of footage. Marcus poured nothing. He didn't trust his hands with a glass. He sat down, opened the first file, and started watching. Some of it was nothing. Staff doing their jobs, ordinary days. His mother pottering in the garden with a sun hat she'd owned for a decade, reading in the sunroom with tea going cold beside her. He let himself hope, for the first hour, that the kitchen incident had been a single, ugly exception. It was not. He found the day her lunch was left on the counter for 4 hours because 2 staff members didn't want to deal with her, while she napped, the soup gone cold and congealed by the time she found it herself. He found Denise telling another staff member that Eleanor was more work than the money's worth, and that she'd rather be cleaning a hotel than babysitting an old woman who can't remember what day it is. He found, 3 weeks back, Paul going through a drawer in Eleanor's bedroom while she was at a doctor's appointment, pocketing something small, checking the hallway twice first. He found his mother asking an empty kitchen, in a small voice, "Does anyone know if my son is coming this week?" No one answered. No one was in the room to hear her ask. The clip ran 8 seconds. Marcus watched it 11 times. By 4 in the morning, Marcus Webb had built a list. Names, dates, timestamps, transcribed quotes, cross-referenced against payroll and shift schedules so nothing could be explained away later as a misunderstanding. 11 members of staff, out of a household of 23. 11 people he paid to care for the woman who had raised him alone after his father left, who had worked 2 jobs so he could finish school, who had sold her own wedding ring the year his company nearly folded so he could make payroll. He thought about firing all 11 that night. He didn't, because some cold, disciplined part of him understood that this decision deserved a clear head and a complete picture, not a middle-of-the-night reaction that might miss something important. He kept watching. He didn't know yet that the worst footage was still 3 folders down, and that watching it would change not just who worked in that house, but how he understood every year of his mother's silence. He found it at 5:20 in the morning. A single camera, the back porch, motion-triggered at 2:14 a.m. Eleanor, in her nightgown, trying a door bolted from the outside at adult height, a step stool nowhere in sight. She pulled gently, then harder, then rested her forehead against the glass, her shoulders slowly dropping. Marcus paused the footage and made himself breathe. She sat down on the floor beside it, not panicked, which was somehow worse, like this was familiar. 40 minutes passed before Denise walked by and let her up with visible irritation, asking why she was wandering, instead of asking why a woman with a heart condition had been locked out of her own porch. The bolt had been added 6 months earlier. Officially, a safety measure. Unofficially, easier to manage a locked door than a woman who sometimes wanted fresh air at 2 a.m. He sat with that for a long time, the sun beginning to come up outside the window. Then he called Reyes and asked him to come to the house at 7 a.m. sharp and to bring HR. The meeting happened in the dining room, the one with the long table and the garden view his mother loved. He chose it deliberately. He didn't raise his voice. He played 11 clips. He named 11 names. For each, the date, the behavior, the consequence, termination, effective immediately, security escort off the property, no severance for the 4 whose conduct involved theft or physical neglect. Denise tried to speak. She's a difficult woman to care for. You don't understand what it's. I watched 6 months of footage last night, he said. I understand exactly what it's like. I watched my mother sit on a floor for 40 minutes at 2 in the morning because someone locked a door at adult height on purpose. So no, don't tell me what I don't understand. Nobody spoke after that. By 9, 11 people were gone. By noon, new leadership was in place, vetted personally, references called himself. He didn't go back to the office that day. He sat with his mother in the garden instead, and for the first time in longer than he could admit, he didn't check his phone once. You didn't have to do all that, Eleanor said eventually. Her bandaged hands were folded in her lap, and the afternoon light was catching the white in her hair the way it used to when he was small, and she'd sit outside reading while he played nearby. Yes, I did. I built you a beautiful house and disappeared from it. I paid people to be present so I wouldn't have to be, and I never once checked whether they actually were. I used to wonder if you'd ever really look. I'm looking now, he said. I'm going to keep looking. Not through a camera. In person. She smiled, tired and small, and squeezed his hand with fingers that still ached under the bandages. Then I suppose those 11 people did one good thing after all. They got my son to come home. Marcus changed his calendar permanently after that. Sundays, no exceptions, no calls, just his mother's kitchen table. He reviewed the footage himself every week now, not out of suspicion of the new staff, but because he'd learned the cost of looking away, and he wasn't willing to pay it twice. Months later, sorting through her things, he found a small velvet box in her nightstand. The wedding ring she'd sold years ago to save his company, bought back quietly, a little at a time, with money she never mentioned. She'd never worn it again. She said it didn't fit the same anymore. But she'd kept it close, the way she'd kept so many things close without ever asking him to notice. Eleanor lived another 6 years after that morning in the dining room. Marcus never missed a Sunday. Years later, at a company all-hands, a young analyst asked him what the hardest lesson of his career had been, expecting, probably, a story about a failed acquisition or a market downer. Marcus thought about it for a long moment before he answered. It wasn't in this building, he said. I learned it in my mother's kitchen, looking at a camera I'd paid for and never watched. I learned that you can build something enormous and still fail completely at the one thing that was never supposed to be complicated, showing up for the people who showed up for you first. He told them, briefly, about the footage, about the 11 names, about a locked door at 2:14 in the morning. He didn't tell it for sympathy. He told it because he'd promised himself, sitting in that garden with his mother's bandaged hand in his, that he would never let the lesson stay private if telling it might save someone else the 8 months he'd lost. Presence, he'd come to understand, wasn't something you could install with a camera or outsource with a salary. It was something you had to choose again and again, in person, because the small, ordinary moments were exactly where someone could disappear quietly for months, while everyone assumed someone else was watching. His mother was watching now, not by a lens, by her son, who had finally come home. And that, more than any company he ever built, was the thing he was proudest of when he finally sat down, years later, to write it all down. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you haven't checked on in a while, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments, what country, what city are you watching from tonight? I read every single one. See you in the next story.